Evening, everybody. Tonight, we're going to finish this series that we've been doing on the Jesuits. I do want to start out just a little thing that if you have a hatch noise machine, turn it off. I'll tell you why next week. We're going to be a little bit long tonight. I don't want to go into the explanation right now, but for right now, turn it off. After next week, you'll probably want to throw it away. Um, don't forget to click like and subscribe here and share if you want to. Also, I've got a link to the books in the bottom. I said I was going to do that last week, and I think I forgot to post the link, but the links are below. And if you do want a special deal on all 3 volumes, just contact me directly, and we do have a special deal for that. I'm going to start out with Proverbs 24, verses 1 through 2 tonight. Be not thou envious against evil men, neither desire to be with them, for their heart studies destruction, and their lips talk of mischief. There's a category of humanity that's evil. That's all there is to it. In the Septuagint, this word evil has to do with oppression. It's somebody who is morally reprehensible. You may have had the displeasure of meeting some of those men, but you may not have known it. Sometimes they keep it buried. Sometimes they disguise it really well as something else. And that's what we're looking at in relation to the Jesuits. They seem good, but underlying that veneer, it may not be quite what it seems. Now, some of them truly are good, but those who control the power structure may have ulterior motives and designs that are not quite so good. And you might say, oh, but they have a good heart. No, they don't. If you see somebody on the news who has just committed some sort of atrocity, the news who is controlled by Jesuits and others of the same mindset, they always present the monster as a sweet kid. They never show the pictures of him threatening people and acting like a degenerate. They pull out his Sunday school photo from when he was 9 years old, and then his mother goes in the news and says, oh, he really is a good person at heart. No, he's not. These are evil people. Luke 6:45, a man, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth that which is good. And an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth that which is evil. For of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks. What you do reveals who you are, and some people are evil, even if they hide it or they try to change evil into something good. They do something evil and say, oh, it's really good. Evil people want to oppress you. They want your liberty, they want your life, they attack you, your wife, your kids. They subvert your children by controlling the public education system, and much of the media that your kids are addicted to are also controlled by these people. Now, if you're weak, and we've looked at how useless a weak Christian is, but if you're weak and you don't stand up to this evil, they're going to win by default. You're going to sacrifice your children if you're nice. These people are part of the powers of darkness. They're good at planning and they have patience. They have time. They'll use words. It's out of the abundance of the heart. The mouth speaks. They'll use words to destroy you. Now, there's a saying that says that the pen is mightier than the sword. That's not quite a true statement because pens don't win battles and swords don't write poetry. But when you know when to pick up the pen and you know when to pick up the sword, that's mighty. The Bible says that sometimes we need the plowshare and sometimes we need the sword, and sometimes we just always have to be ready. Now, these evil people, they will devise violence. They won't necessarily do it with their own hands if they can get others to do it for them. But violence is the very basis for any left wing political ideology, wherever it comes from. But yet, with their lips, they use words that they convince people that peace is violence and violence is peace. The sword of the pen. Which one you need depends upon the circumstances. They plan violence, and the wise man, the one who is not foolish or not stupid, but the wise man has to be full of strength and knowledge. The wise man knows which battle to fight. The fool causes problems, and the wise man can prevent problems, or at least can prepare a defense against the foolish. The foolish, sadly, they've always outnumbered the wise, and the foolish will listen to the words of the evil people. In our world today, the foolish far outnumber the wise, and so we need to listen to God's counsel, which is right here in our Bibles. When you read your Bible every day, whether you open in the book, whether you're reading it on your computer, but you read it in your Bible, you use your brains to interpret what God's told us, and we gird up our loins and we prepare to fight. That's God's counsel. Now, if you watch with interviews with the average voter in the United States today, you understand that my cat can make better decisions than most of these voters. And far too many believers fall into the same category. They blindly follow whatever they're told to do. And so many local congregations promote evil, worldly ideologies and agendas while their Bibles gather dust because they want to be relevant. That's the word they use. We want to be relevant to the world. So we're going to put the Bible down and we're going to tell you what we think. Now, everybody is foolish sometimes, but it's our responsibility to make sure that we're not fools, that we're not foolish continuously. Some people are wiser in some areas than others. For example, one person might be wise with finance and another might be wise with relationships. And this is why a few months back we looked at type 1 and type 2 thinking. Basically, if you're an expert in some field, you may know the answer to a problem without thinking too hard about it, or you may know where to find the answer quickly. That's type 1 thinking. On the other hand, some of us need to really stop and think before we make a decision about an area in which we lack knowledge. That's why we have the Bible, so that we can make informed decisions before we do it. And if we don't do this, we're going to be led astray. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 through 14. And he gave some apostles and some prophets and some evangelists and some pastor teachers, is one word, and it's one gift. And this is not an office, this is a gift, pastor teacher. But he gave them for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come in the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, unto a perfect man, unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we be no more children, tossed to and fro, and carried about with every wind of doctrine, by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness, whereby they lie in wait to deceive. If we're not prepared, if we don't prepare ourselves, we're going to be tossed to and fro by these evil men and by their doctrines. And we can see this in most of the world today, and in much, actually probably most of the church. One of the doctrines that these evil men promote is to treat everybody the same, no matter what. And we already looked at that. There are some categories of men that we're not to associate with at all. If you find somebody who is evil, you do not treat them equally. We're not to treat fools the same as we would treat the wise. Correct them? Probably, but what's the situation? Are they continuously foolish and reject all correction? Maybe it's time to help somebody else. Maybe not. Pray about it. That's going to vary from situation to situation. 2 Corinthians 6:14. Be ye not unequally yoked. And this has to do with a difference of kind, not just simple inequality. But be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. Don't become partners with unbelievers. And unbelievers are those who are not believing in the present tense. These are people who are actively being unbelieving or unfaithful. It may be somebody who's in the family that's just disobeying, they're being disobedient. For what fellowship, and this has to do with being a partaker in, but what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness or lawlessness? And what communion or partnership hath light with darkness? Now, this refers back to Leviticus 19:19 and Deuteronomy 22:10, which tells us to not yoke two unequal beasts together. It is literally a different yoke. Being yoked together is intimacy, and not necessarily in a sexual sense, but in a fellowship sense. If your daughter wants to date a fool or an evil person, it's your responsibility to do your best to prevent that. And you certainly don't want to date, marry, or go into business with somebody who's foolish or evil. They're going to drag you down with them. You do not treat them equally. Elon Musk recently said something along the lines of empathy is destroying the Western world. And people were outraged by that. People would say without empathy, we're nothing but animals. They would just went on and on and on about that. But the point of what he was saying was not to have no empathy, but not to have too much empathy. And that's what the Bible tells us to do. We tend to have too much empathy because our emotions get the best of us, but at a certain point, the empathy needs to stop. Do you still care? Certainly. But you don't become an enabler or you don't become a promoter of bad behavior. Evil people and fools are beyond your help unless God shows up and does the work in them. Saul, who became the Apostle Paul, he was a murderer going around murdering people, thinking he was doing good. But it literally took Jesus showing up and whacking him in the head to get him to change. Pray for these people, but you do not treat them equally. Proverbs 24, verses 1 through 2. Be not thou envious against evil men, neither desire to be with them, for their heart studies destruction and their lips talk of mischief. Evil people are intentionally dangerous, and fools will blindly follow evil people. Fools don't learn cause and effect. So while their actions may not be intentionally evil, they're still doing evil works. God knows their hearts, but you and I, we don't know their hearts. We need to use discernment as to their actions, and then we need to act in a prayerful manner. I didn't mean to set the house on fire. Yeah, but you put a pot of beans on and went to the store and decided to visit a friend and then went to a movie. Sometimes these people have been through a lot of trauma in their lives and it's impacted them negatively, and sometimes they're raised to be foolish. But these people are foolish on a regular basis, and I'm of the opinion that there's so much trauma that's created in this world in order to create a larger class of foolish people who are going to blindly follow the evil leaders. And if you've ever encountered people who were raised by narcissists, their behavior is the result of that. But that's not an excuse because people can change, but it takes effort. And not only this, but boys tend to look up to their dads. And if they have a dad that was evil, they're going to be evil unless they intentionally change. And this doesn't even take into account genetic memory. Recently in the news, there was a 4-year-old child in a car, 4 years old. He tried to shoot a cop because his father told him to. That child is going to have serious problems, even though at 4 years old, he's only being obedient to an evil father. What's going to happen to this child in the future? But the Bible tells us to not have relationships with these people. You have emotions and you have empathy, and they're going to use that to destroy you, or at least they're going to try to damage you to some degree. Judas Iscariot opened himself up to evil. In his mind, it sounded good. What he did sounded like the right thing to do, but it was evil. From all appearances, and the only crime that the Bible accuses him of is that he stole money from the bag. But from all appearances, he believed Jesus was who he said he was, and he was simply trying to force his hand to actively show himself as the Messiah. But he was looking for a political Messiah. And many preachers will teach that he was never truly in the family, but from everything the Bible tells us, he was truly a believer, and he was truly an apostle, and he truly worked miracles. But he let his emotions guide him into evil actions. Now, these evil people, they're completely corrupted, and their behavior is very dangerous, not just to themselves, but to others. If you listen to them, they're going to lead you astray because they're very convincing. They've convinced themselves. That's how they can convince you, but they've convinced themselves that what they're doing is right. They're going to convince you that what they're doing is right, and they're going to take you down the same path. Most of these people who do these stupid things are not evil, but they're stupid and they've let themselves be misled. And we live in a culture that says that people are basically good, and our culture says that all religions are equal, and some even say that everybody's all the same. People who murder, kidnap, and rape women and children, they're not good people. And when they do it in the name of their religion, that religion is not equal to my religion, Christianity. The religion that does those things, that's evil. It's demonic, and you see them all over the world today causing problems. Back to Judas for a moment. The actions of Judas, no matter his intent, it led to the illegal trial and the brutal treatment of Jesus, which culminated at the cross. It had to happen. It was prophesied in the Old Testament, not just his death, but the crucifixion, which didn't even exist as a form of punishment when it was prophesied. So these events had to happen. But it was the betrayal of a friend that directly led to the actions that caused it to happen. And have you ever had anybody in your life that was evil, but you were unaware of that until they betrayed you? A spouse, a business partner, a friend, and not just people who sinned and committed an evil act, but you find out that they're truly evil people. There's someone, they're evil, they try to get near to you or your family in order to use you for evil gain. Or how about evil people who try to get near your children? That hatch sound machine that I talked about earlier that we're going to go into next week, that's related to that. Here in the United States, and I don't know about other countries, we have drag queen story hours where these deviants want to talk to your children. They don't go to nursing homes, they go to where children are. These people who want to use you, it may just be a broken girl who wants to manipulate and sexually control your strong son. You may have a son who's strong, but he's found this girl that he loves and she's just being manipulative. Or it could be a really dangerous guy who wants to take advantage of your daughter who's a little bit naive or something like that. You have to be strong and you have to teach your children to be strong. And you have to teach your children to be wise. And if you don't do that, they'll be destroyed. Is that paranoid? Not really, it's discernment. But these broken people and these damaged people, they're easy to control and manipulate. They become stupid and foolish even if they didn't start out that way. And you can make a great promise like free food or free housing. You know, there's a saying that the mouse doesn't realize why the cheese in the trap is free until it's too late. Well, these people fall into the same category. And this is a tool that evil people in control will create and use for power. And that's what we're looking at with the Jesuits. They control fools. And we've looked at their oath, at least one that they took historically, even if they don't use it currently. And we've looked at some of their history. We can't do it in depth, that would take days, but we've looked at some. You know, the Bible does have something to say about taking oaths. Matthew 5, verses 34 through 37. But I say unto you, swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it's his footstool, neither by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Neither shalt thou swear by thy head, because thou cannot make one hair white or black, but let your communication be yea, yea, nay, nay, for whatsoever is more than these comes of evil. Many Jesuits who realize that what they're doing is wrong, they understand that they took an oath, and instead of breaking the oath, they simply seek to be released from it. Some of them realize that the oath is evil, they simply break it. But we need to be careful about oaths, and we saw what their oath was and what they swore to do. But beyond what we've looked at already, we are going to look at some Jesuit books and we're going to use their own words. It's what we've been doing here. We've been using words from the Catholics, from the Jesuits themselves. We're not taking anything else. Not my opinion, not somebody else's opinion, but their words. These books are available in facsimile form online. You can also buy them, but they're very old and very expensive. But these books will show some of what they actually believe. Now, obviously, we don't have all of their books because much of their stuff is secret and some of it's been lost, but we can look at what we do have. And in one book, which was a collection of several smaller works that was compiled by Philip LeBay and Gabriel Cosarth, was a collection of decrees and ecumenical councils, and it's a history that goes back several centuries. The history of the Jesuits goes back prior to their founding, and they made sure to write it down so that it would be remembered. Later, other priests would look at the book and say, okay, so this is decided already, and I don't have to think about it or pray about it. That was gospel to them. They saw it in the book. It'd be like a precedent for a court. Although a court can revisit the legitimacy of the original decree, but generally courts will say, based on this case law, we do this. One of the decrees that they made prohibits people from owning a Bible. They don't want you to read it. They want you to simply, blindly obey them. I saw this in the community with the Russian Orthodox. It was really frowned upon for individuals selling the Bible. You're supposed to trust a priest, not read it for yourself. It says, we prohibit also that the laity should be permitted to have the books of the Old or New Testament, unless anyone from motive of devotion should wish to have the Psalter or the breviary for divine offices or the hours of the Blessed Virgin. But we most strictly forbid their having any translation of these books. There were those who were tortured and executed for translating the Bible for the masses. They died for translating the words of God. And these Jesuits were the persecutors that executed them. This is Dark Ages stuff going on well after the Dark Ages were over. This is not about preventing faulty translations, but this is against translations that people could read. And this came out of the Council of Trent in the Index Laborum Prohibitorium. And there's a statement on the Vatican's website that says that when the Bible is given to laity, it causes more harm than good. Harm to whom? Their observation is that when the laity has a Bible, they can actually read and study for themselves. It exposed Rome for what it was under the Jesuits. Rome, the Catholic Church is not always evil. But when it was controlled by the Jesuits, they wanted to keep it a secret. Well, by having your own Bibles, it would shed light, and that light was not good for those who wanted to control things. Ephesians 5, verses 11 through 13. And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. For it's a shame even to speak of those things which are done of them in secret. But all things that are reproved are made manifest by the light. For whatsoever doth make manifest is light. We need the light to expose the darkness. But the darkness doesn't want to be exposed. When they say it does more harm than good, it does harm to these dark forces that we've been looking at over the past few weeks. They'll tell you what it says. Don't worry about that. Oh, here's the collection plate, by the way, after I just told you what this says. I don't want you to read it. The Reformation triggered a very strong response along these lines. It created a counter-Reformation within the church. In the Protestant Reformation, they started translating the Bible into all these common languages so that people could read it. Therefore, they were persecuted by the Catholic Church under the Jesuits. And you have to remember that for centuries, the church had the strongest army in Europe. And when they were controlled by certain people, people would be persecuted until they gave up on their desire to have their own Bible and their own language. Now, this has obviously gotten better, but this is history. That's what we're looking at, is the history of this group. When the church burned books, what they burned were translations. That was one of the first things that they used to fuel the fires. They didn't like the translations. That's what they burned. God, our Heavenly Father, He is not a God of coercion. We're all given free will, and we can choose to serve Him or we can choose to not serve Him. But those who were in power at the time had no problem using coercion up to the point of burning people at the stake. Further from this book, the Patarines and other heretics, whereby whatever name they are considered, we decide what they affect, that they may be burned alive in the sight of men by the fiery judgment. Now, the Patarines, they were people in northern Italy who lived a very simple lifestyle, and they were opposed to the wealth and the power of the Catholic Church at the time, and they were persecuted along with many others. Now, the philosophy of Christ is a pretty savage philosophy of poverty. And I say savage here because it hit right at the heart of the political power. He didn't pull any punches, but it hit right at the heart of the political power at the time. And this political power had enslaved the people to a slavery of debt. During this time period where they were being burned at the stake, the Catholic Church was the political power. And when the Patarines taught the same philosophy that Christ taught, they hit right at their purse strings. Now, what constitutes poverty is a philosophical discussion. There's a worthy discussion, but not here and now. Obviously, some of it's going to be subjective. Now, the constitutions of Frederick, who was the emperor at the time, supported this. And this followed upon Pope Innocent IV's original bull, which instituted torture at the time of the Inquisition. I find the name Innocent to be quite ironic in the context of instituting torture for wanting to read the Bible. But these declarations condemned many different groups at the time to torture. And this went on into the 16th century. So it's not like ancient history. Um, and this was written about at least as late as 1569 that these events were happening. It may have gone on past that, but we know that some of these things happened as late as 1569. Dirk Willems was condemned for being an Anabaptist, and in 1569 he escaped. Well, during his pursuit, it was in the wintertime. That's how he ran across the moat. One of the guards was chasing him, fell through the ice, and this guy actually turned around and rescued him, saved his life, and therefore he was recaptured and then burned alive at the stake. But the pages of this book are literally dripping with the blood of people who were martyrs for Christ. There's another book that the Jesuits have that instructs priests to torture Protestants until they recant their beliefs and return to the Catholic Church before being executed. Oh, they also had to snitch on other Protestants. They tortured them to their snitch until they would recant their beliefs, and then they'd be executed. Basically, they were saying, we'll stop torturing you if you admit you were wrong and you turn in all your buddies. This prohibits them from breaking their arms or legs. That was reserved for robbers and murderers, but anything else was fair game. There were rules against breaking arms or legs, but these books, which had the force of law, literally legislated for torture simply for reading the Bible. And these were not atheists, at least not in the strictest sense, but it was the visible church which had been taken over by evil men. And for modern day martyrs, you can read Richard Wurmbrand. He will tell you a lot about what was going on in the Soviet Union against Christians, which was as brutal as what happened to them during the Inquisition. Really savage times. And you say, this is all the past, right? Revelation 13 tells us that it's going to happen again. And Revelation 17 tells us it's going to be the same group. It's all under the authority of Satan. Ecclesiastes 3:15 says, that which hath been is now, and that which is to be hath already been, and God requires that which is past. When we look to the future, if we know the past, we learn that history repeats itself. It doesn't actually repeat itself, but it rhymes very closely. What has happened in the past will happen once again in the not too distant future. Now, in another passage in the little book, says, neither let any commerce be held with them in selling and buying, that the comfort of humanity, having been lost, they may be compelled to return from the error of the way. That's coercion, and it sounds familiar. Revelation 13:17, and that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. They use the exact same techniques to force people to follow them. Now, a mark shows ownership. You sell your life in order to gain your life. It's the same idea as forfeiting your life to gain your life. But the difference is, to whom do you forfeit it? If you wanted to read your Bible or you converted to Protestantism, you'd not be able to buy or sell unless you gave yourself back over to them. And I witnessed this in the bush in Alaska. When somebody would convert from the Orthodox Church, the rest of the town would refuse to do business with them until they returned. In these areas, you couldn't simply drive to the next town and buy groceries. If you've ever heard the expression, we use it commonly in the South, says, you can't get there from here. That's what many of these bush villages in Alaska are like. You would literally be destroyed for having a different religious belief. The Bible never teaches coercion as a method of evangelization. Many have used violence and coercion in the past, but it's not biblical. Now, this specific rule in this book came out from the Synod of Tours against the Albigenses, I can't say that word, during the 12th century. And this is also going to happen again in the last days. When I was a kid growing up in Tennessee, we had what were called blue laws. Only certain businesses could be open, such as gas stations and restaurants, in order to promote a day of rest. Even today, many states ban the sale of alcohol, cars, and other items on Sunday. Surprisingly, it looks as if even parts of Canada and parts of Europe, they do the same thing. But the history of blue laws is pretty extreme. The first blue law in America was instituted in Virginia in 1610. It was not called a blue law at the time. The term blue law is more recent, but it was a law that prohibited business on Sunday. If you didn't go to church, the first punishment was no buying or selling, and the second offense was getting lashes, and the third time you missed church, execution. And not just the morning services, but you had to do morning and afternoon. Now, I couldn't find anywhere when anybody was actually executed for this, but it was on the books. So my assumption is they either didn't enforce the law or everybody knew enough to go to church. So improper worship means you can't buy or sell. And if you persist, persecution and death. Now, while the blue laws are not quite as extreme today, I can't recall seeing news of anybody being whipped for not being in church recently. They still exist. It's not enforced worship, but it does say you can't shop freely on Sunday, only that which they permit you to shop. And you say, what does this have to do with the book of Revelation and Bible prophecy and a mark? Well, we're going to get to that. This little Jesuit book that we're looking at, you go a couple pages forward, and you find that anybody who sustains someone who is forbidden from buying or selling, that person is also going to be in trouble. And if the powers that be say that this person can't buy or sell and you transact business with him, you will be the next target. This is complete and total coercion. There are people today, recently came out wanting to reinstitute blue laws. And I'm not talking about businesses who voluntarily choose to close on Sunday so that their families can spend time together. That's commendable. We have quite a few of those. But I'm talking about they're wanting to pass laws that prohibit any transaction of business on Sundays. And these laws are even being suggested at the federal level. We need to understand that it's not bad to have a day off to spend time with our families. And also, as I've stated before, it's my opinion that Sunday is fine instead of the Sabbath because the spirit of the law is to have a day off for worship and family. However, I may be changing my opinion on that. It's not bad to have a day off, but when we institute a power structure in place to enforce these laws, the beast system simply has to move in and take them over. It's like any power structure. Evil people will want to control it, and in this case, it's the beast system that's coming next. And make no mistake about it, the beast system that's coming is demonic, but it's not merely an individual. People often portray the beast as an individual. The language in the Bible tells us that it is a system. It's a coming artificial intelligence antichrist, the AI gods. And as Christians, we should be opposed to this kind of coercion. Now, elsewhere in this little book, the position of the Pope is inflated, and he's presented as being in place of Christ. Thessalonians 2, verses 3 through 4. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. The beast system will make himself equal to God. He will be God. And all humanist and left-wing political systems necessitates that you put yourself into the position of a God, but you have to subvert your will to the God of state. In other words, they want you to be the prime focus of everything except for them. You have to submit to them. And we saw last week that the Pope used to wear on his hat that he is in place of Christ. Not all popes wore that, but some did. Some popes realized, hey, that's not a good thing to be saying. And there's other statements made about the Pope from the Catholic sources, and I've got a link to this below if you want to read it later. You can go through and read some of these statements. But one of them is the Pope is not only the representative of Jesus Christ, but he is Jesus Christ himself, hidden under the veil of flesh. Catholic words, not mine. Take care that we lose not that salvation, that life and breath which thou hast given us. For thou art our shepherd, thou art our physician, thou art our governor, thou art our husbandman, thou art finally another God on earth. This was Christopher Marcellus in 1512 at the Fifth Lateran Council. In Extravagantes Johannes, which is a Catholic legal text, it refers to the Pope as our Lord God the Pope. The Vatican I said the Pope is Christ in office, Christ in jurisdiction and power. We bow down before thy voice, O Holy Father, as we would before Christ himself. And you get the idea. And there are more that pull imagery from the Bible and they apply it to the Pope that's in power at the time. And it's not all popes. Some of the popes are almost evangelical. But there are some who have put themselves into positions that they should not have put themselves. Some of the popes rejected these ideas, so it's not individual Catholics, it's not all popes, and it's not even the Catholic Church itself, but it's a small group that seeks to control the power structure. They put themselves in the place of God, and in the book of Revelation, that corrupted system is going to put itself in place of God. Even the imagery that you find in the Vatican flag, the gold and silver intertwined with the red cord, symbolizes the unity of the church and state. This flag was adopted in 1929, and the official story is that the cross keys represent the keys of St. Peter. However, the cross keys specifically were a pagan symbol before that, and they were used to represent Gnosticism, and they were used by the Illuminati, and they still are. Yet they're on the flag that represents this combining of church and state. Now, in the United States, although we were founded as a Christian nation, and actually that foundation precedes the United States going back to the 1600s, there was not to be an official church and state bond. What we have today, a separation of church and state, is not what was originally intended, but we've let dark forces redefine terms so that it now means you can't carry a Bible or say a prayer in any public place, even if it's a silent prayer. I'm happy to report that here in Texas, we ignore these laws and our police cars still say, "In God we trust," and our Friday night football games are open with prayer. But those who came here in the first place to escape the unification of church and state, they didn't want to prohibit religion, but they wanted to prohibit the coercion either for or against it. And in these books that the Jesuits wrote, almost every reference to God is, in reality, a reference to the sitting Pope. And remember, these are Jesuit books, not official Catholic doctrine, but the Jesuits held power for a lot of Catholic history. Daniel 7:25, and he shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. He shall speak great words, or speak words. The word great's not in there. He shall speak words against the Most High. Remember back to Proverbs 24, verses 1 through 2? Be not thou envious against evil men, neither desire to be with them, for their heart studies destruction, and their lips talk of mischief. The beast's power is going to speak words against the Most High, and many are going to follow this system. Some of them who are going to follow them are going to be in the family. They're going to be deceived, but it's going to wear out the saints. And I'm here in the South. When you say, "I'm going to wear you out," that's the way to say, "I want to fight, and you're going to lose." But do you see what else it says here? It says, "and think to change times and laws." We have evidence of that being done intentionally at the Council of Trent. First, do you know the times? Do you know the feast days? I know a little bit, but I need to know more. How about laws? Some of the laws of God changed in the way they were carried out, but what about the ones that he didn't change? At the Council of Trent, the most glorious day in the law, the Sabbath, was changed to the Lord's Day. Now, I grew up hearing Sunday referred to as the Christian Sabbath. There's no such thing. The Sabbath is a Sabbath is a Sabbath. There's a regular seventh-day Sabbath that comes every week on Saturday, and then there are high Sabbaths which come with the holy days. Sunday is the first day of the week. And although he arose on Saturday, his empty tomb was discovered on Sunday. Pentecost was on a Sunday, but the Sabbath is still the Sabbath. This was not destroyed by Jesus. He came to fulfill the law, not to destroy it. But this day was changed intentionally by the authority of the Catholic Church. And to think to change times and laws. This is the only one of the 10 commandments that has anything at all to do with time. If you look at any sort of executive decree, it's sealed by the king, the president, whatever, by title, dominion, and date. Charles, King of England, on the 17th day of November 2025, or Donald J. Trump, President of the United States of America, signed October 23rd, 2025. The fourth commandment is literally God's seal. We're not going to read the entire list of commandments, but He's the God of gods. He's the creator of the universe, and the Sabbath is the date. Exodus 28 says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. This is the only commandment that starts with remember. If you wanted to attack the laws of God in order to get people to disregard God and to disobey His commandments, then you would want people to not remember. But it says to change and to think to change times and laws. Daniel told us that it was going to be changed. You say, but what does this have to do with the Jesuits, brother? Historically, Christians kept the Sabbath. And most people say, oh, but that's Jewish. No, this one is not a Jewish law. This law was given to the world. It is literally encoded into every language group in the world. Every language group in the world, this is the seventh day. It's also encoded into historical precedent. Proverbs 31, verses 4 through 5. It is not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes, and princes are rulers in the modern use, nor for princes strong drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. Wine is not for kings, and strong drink is not for rulers because they forget the law. Revelation 17:2. With whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. In Revelation 14, verses 9 through 10. And the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast in his image and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation, and he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. So how did this come about? How did worship get changed from the Sabbath to Sunday? Constantine, Emperor Constantine. He passed an edict that people should gather and worship on the day to honor the sun, Sunday. And it goes back earlier than this as far as tradition, but this is where it was passed into law that we're going to worship the sun, Sunday. And being passed in the law is the bigger problem than tradition. It was gradual apostasy that changed from the Sabbath to Sunday. One person would worship on Sunday, and another would cite a church father, and they would continue on. And as I've stated, my opinion is that we're to have a day of worship, but when that day is mandated to be changed, that's where my doubts creep in. Not that you do it, but that the government mandates it. And that's my opinion. But this was a declaration by a man. God didn't change this officially. It was a man. Once Constantine, who was a Roman emperor, became a Christian, he got on board and said that it was going to be the official religion. It was changed. It was church and state combined. Instead of saying you're free to choose, it became you'll do it our way or else. And we're not going to turn there, but if you think back to Nebuchadnezzar, he did the same thing. After he was converted, he said, okay, everybody, we're all going to follow Daniel's God now. When Constantine decided that everybody was going to be a Christian, in order to make it easier for the Romans who worship all the false gods, he decided to Christianize all those things. And since they worshiped on Sunday, they worshiped the sun, he decided Christians needed to do that also, for the sake of convenience. If there was a statue of some false god, instead of casting it out, they would say, okay, now this one is St. Peter, and this one is St. John. Do we still do that today? We saw an example of it earlier, but we don't do that in the Protestant tree, right? Yeah, we do. Originally, Constantine allowed for 2 days of worship, both the Sabbath and Sunday. But even back then, anti Semitism was creeping in, and the Sabbath was considered to be somewhat Jewish, even though Protestant Christians were keeping it. And it became less and less popular, and Sunday became more and more popular than the Sabbath, and that's how it changed. And so anybody who says Christians keeping the Sabbath is not historical, they're wrong. And although man had a tendency to turn the Sabbath from a blessing into a burden, in the 13th century they did so intentionally. It was observed in one of the Jesuit books that there were many people observing the Sabbath, so they decided that they would turn it into a fast day and then turn Sunday into a feast day, as well as passing regulations making it more and more difficult to observe the Sabbath in order to enforce their worship on Sunday. Now, although most Protestant churches say that Sunday is a celebration of the resurrection and it's the birthday of the church, it was not made so for ideological reasons, but as a way of capitulating to the demands of the church that was in power at the time instead of fighting them on it. And Sunday is the day of Pentecost when the church was born, but that's not why they changed it. Their own books say that the peasants were still observing the Sabbath, which really irritated the church leadership as late as the Council of Friuli in 791. But the Sabbath is the seventh day. Sunday is the first day, and that's why most calendars begin with Sunday. When it comes to Sunday worship, the symbol of both the Jesuits and the Catholic Church are about sun worship. Also, the Mesopotamian sun god Shamash, this is his symbol. That's also been brought into the Catholic Church in certain places. You can see it right there. And this is with Pope John Paul II. Most Catholics are not aware of this. Well, this little book also states that it's divine law that no one is to do manual labor on Sundays and holidays. In order to avoid what they call the indignation of Almighty God, the only manual labor that's permitted is that which is urgent, and even then it has to be performed with piety and with special permission of the priest. Anybody who violated this was to be excommunicated. Can't buy or sell if you don't do what we say. Well, at the Council of Laodicea, that's when it became a concern that Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, but they must work on the Sabbath. It became a commandment. They could take off Monday, but they had to work on the Sabbath. And it was a few centuries before this became enforced. But it's interesting to note that they continuously refer to Sunday as the Lord's Day, but the Bible tells us that He's Lord of the Sabbath. They try to say that those are two different terms, but the Bible tells us which one's correct. He rested on the Sabbath, and he rose on the first day of the week. Well, he rose at the end of the Sabbath, and he was discovered on the first day of the week. There are some who say that since he died, he did away with the Sabbath. If that's so, why did he rest on the Sabbath? He didn't have to if he did away with it. But in Matthew 24, Jesus is talking about the end times, and the disciples ask him when these things are going to be, and what shall be the sign of the coming and the end of the world. Well, he goes through and he lists several different things, such as wars and rumors of wars, famines, pestilences, plagues, false Christs, false prophets who are going to deceive many. And then he says in verse 20, but pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. If the Sabbath had been abolished, and since that day would be long after his death, burial, and resurrection, this verse wouldn't make any sense. And Jesus is not a nonsensical person. The Sabbath is still the Sabbath. Paul says there remains a day. We see that the peasants were still keeping the Sabbath, therefore we can see that the day was changed just as it was prophesied in Daniel 7. Modern Christianity has been deceived into believing a lie. As I stated before, and I'm going to say it again, it's my opinion that the spirit of the law is to have a day for rest and worship. But we need to be aware of the importance of the Sabbath. And the Sabbath is a Sabbath. There is no such thing as what is taught as the Christian Sabbath. How could the majority be deceived? Well, the majority, or at least those in power, they rejected Jesus as the Messiah. Can't really go by what the majority says. So the tradition of worshiping on Sunday is a tradition that was brought in by coercion of those in power who wanted to demonstrate their power. In fact, for those who violated Sunday rest, they could receive 100 lashes. You'd be punished if you kept the Sabbath, but you didn't keep what the church decreed, and you could get lashes. And this is why blue laws are so problematic. It's a service to God out of fear of man. You don't serve God out of fear of God. It's service to God out of fear of man and not out of love to God. It is simply self-preservation against the force of man in support of man-made laws. If you obey just because of what you can get out of it, it is obedience, but it's a miserable existence. And that's not correct Christianity, but it is a fulfillment of prophecy. And this is why we need to be aware of what's going on. Now, once again, I think it's fine together on Sunday, what we're doing here, but when they try to enforce that, it's time to look out, or better yet, look up. When they require it, the end is coming. The end is near. Just as we need to be aware of and understand the ancient feast days, we need to understand the Sabbath and all the imagery surrounding it. In the past, the church system used coercion to force others to comply, and they persecuted and condemned those who refused to comply. When people started to become aware that this forced change of days is a fulfillment of prophecy, it's a fulfillment of the literal antichrist power, that's the word that's used. This led to the Protestant Reformation and the Protestant movement. Well, the Jesuits manipulated Rome into countering the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation exposed what the Jesuits were doing. So at the Fifth Lateran Council, they prohibited studying the signs or the seasons for the judgment and the Antichrist, and when the Antichrist would come. You couldn't read your Bible and you couldn't study these things, and it was a crime. The Jesuits then introduced contradictory doctrines of preterism through Luis Alcazar and futurism through Francisco Ribera de Villacastin. They introduced contradictory doctrines intentionally so they could create chaos and conflict in order to divide and conquer. So what did this do to the understanding of the Antichrist power? Well, from the Dark Ages to the French Revolution was 1,260 years. 538 AD from Justinian's Codex that declared the Pope head of all the churches, to 1798 when Napoleon declared an end to papal supremacy. The Jesuits said that they were not okay with that. They didn't like those numbers. So they introduced both preterism and futurism. Preterism looks at Revelation 1 through 11 and says that it was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans and focused on pagan Rome and declared that Nero was the Antichrist before all these judgments were passed. Now, since Satan is not omnipotent, he doesn't know when the end is going to be. He always has to have somebody ready to fulfill the requirements for the final Antichrist. So Nero may have been his man, but we know now that he was not the final Antichrist. While futurism, as opposed to preterism, says that it's all future. And somehow we never seem to arrive at the present. The Jesuits don't care which of these two you believe, just as long as you don't look too closely at these doctrines. The doctrine of futurism was written by a Jesuit under a Jewish pen name so that it would appear to be Jewish writing so as to create further conflict. It was a Jesuit priest calling himself a Jew just to make people angry about it. And as we looked at their vows last week, their vow permits them to infiltrate Judaism and the Protestant churches and to be spies. Therefore, they can say, I'm Catholic or I'm Protestant or I'm Jewish, as the situation would call for it. And they were fine with that. Perhaps the service would change a little bit when they would do this, and usually not for the better. Do we see that happening in churches today? It may not be the Jesuits, but it is demonic. But our church services are changing, not for the better. But they're very deceptive. They're spies and not of the good variety. There are some very common Protestant beliefs that are almost correct, but they were introduced by the Jesuits. They follow more closely to the lies of futurism that was written by Via Cassin. In other words, it's almost correct, but not quite. And many Protestants follow it very closely, and they will reject any biblical evidence that's contrary to it. So they say all roads lead to Rome. And that seems to apply to many Protestant beliefs that are not quite correct. And this is why we need to study, and this is why we need to search the scriptures daily as they did in Acts 17:11. Now, the reality is that prophecies usually have a near-term fulfillment and a future fulfillment, and often more than one future fulfillment. But only the final fulfillment will be complete. Therefore, the prophecies may have been partially fulfilled in the past, but preterism says that that's all there is. Well, futurism ignores partial fulfillment and says it's all in the future. Well, the Bible shows us that some of them have been partially fulfilled, often more than once, with the final fulfillment yet to come. And in the near future, that future is getting nearer every day. We need to see the past in order to understand the present and the future. And if we, as Protestants or Baptists, in my case, if we're blind to what takes place in the middle, that's fine with Satan. It works for him. That'll work to achieve his purposes. Well, the Jesuits will have you see either the past or the future, but not what's in the middle, and especially not multiple fulfillments of the same prophecies. And that's what we have here, where the Antichrist power, and remember, Antichrist means in place of Christ, but this Antichrist power ruled for 1,260 years. The beast that was, the beast that was and is not, and yet is. From Revelation 17:8. 1,260 days, times time and half a time, 42 months. But that may just be a coincidence, right? The beast will receive a deadly wound and lose power, which happened in the Catholic Church when they lost state power, but it will return. And the power that ruled in the past will rule again in the future. It's not the Catholic Church, it's the power structure of the church that has been hijacked. And remember, the Vatican flag combined religious and political power. Today, power is being given back to the church, not officially, but in reality, that's what's happening. The climate change cult, Pope Francis demanded that people carpool and turn off their air conditioning. He obviously wasn't here in Texas. They're all eaten up with the LGBTQ movement. They're all pushing for socialism. The Pope speaks to world governments, spoke at the G7 Economic Forum. He doesn't know economics, but he spoke to the Economic Forum. He speaks to the United Nations. He's nothing official, but political power is given to him. Typically, most ministers in the Protestant side of things are also clueless about economics, but the Jesuits are very aware of economics and they know how to use it to gain power. Most Protestant ministers, they're clueless about it. They do the same thing, but they don't do it on purpose. As believers, it's our responsibility to know what's going on, and that's why we study. The Bible tells us that study is the highest form of worship, not swaying back and forth and raising your hands and clapping and singing and dancing, but study. The meat of the word. You have to work for that. We have the responsibility to preach and teach to others about the conflict between Jesus and his angels, between Satan and his angels, and how this all plays into end time events. We've been warned and we need to warn others. I've talked to non-believers who watch the news and they know that something's up, but so many people within the church think things are just fine. However, those who control this world, they're funneling everyone into the same ideology and mindset, and they can't discern from the truth. The beast power is back, and it's going to be stronger than ever, even if it's not fully implemented yet. The Nephilim have returned from exile, and they're acting to get their positions of power back. These psychological maneuvers are not accidental. They're completely intentional, and they're wreaking havoc in the world today. There are literally, in the news recently, gangs of 9-year-old kids beating women and children. Criminals being treated as royalty. The American mind is being coddled, and that which is unacceptable is being praised. And it's not just the Jesuits, but there are others behind the scenes that are pushing this departure from all that's righteous. It's the minority that's causing the chaos, but the minority is all that's required to create revolution, and revolution is not always good. We need to follow what the Bible says, and we need to follow Jesus. What would Jesus do? Oh, he was a savage philosopher who flipped over tables and whipped people when the situation called for it. And he's coming back soon. Make no mistake about it, the Jesuits are still alive and kicking today, and they have more power than they've had in centuries. And it's not the Catholic people, it's not the Catholic Church, but it's the power structure that's been hijacked. And not everybody associated with the Jesuits are part of the problem. They have some of the best colleges available. But I've noticed a tendency for those who attend to those colleges to come away with some of the doctrines. I have to call it Jesuit light, but not all. Some students simply go to their colleges for the education. Some students are marked for specific mentoring, however. And many of these called out students continue to go on to Ivy League education, and you can see them wreaking havoc on culture along with others of a like mind that come from other Ivy League colleges. Sometimes the Jesuits will create contradictory doctrines that will create confusion and chaos. Sometimes they will work with other secret societies. Some of these other secret societies are banned by the Catholic Church. And sometimes they will work in opposition to these other secret groups, whatever gets them the most power. If we as believers are to be effective warriors, we must not have tunnel vision and focus upon only one front while they attack us from the rear. You know, if you think back to the 90s when Desert Storm happened, that's exactly what happened. All the media leaked that the United States was going to attack Saddam Hussein's forces from the sea, and the whole world was watching for the ships to come in and start blasting. Then the military attacked from the desert, and the battle was almost over before it began. Critical thinking is disappearing. And that's why, as Christians, we must learn to think critically. We need to be aware of our surroundings. And if we use ideals for physical war and we apply them to spiritual war, it'll be a great benefit to us. The enemy is not going to play by any set of rules. And I don't know who said it first, but it's a wise saying that if you prepare for a fair fight, then your tactics are terrible. You need to prepare for a just fight, but not a fair fight. You have to be overly prepared. And the enemy is going to use many different tactics. They're going to create black swan events. And if a black swan event takes place on its own, you better believe that they'll take advantage of that. They'll use psychological tactics of many sorts. And we've seen some that were developed by the Jesuits or under their authority, such as MK Ultra and Project Mockingbird, but they will conduct many other psychological operations or psyops. They'll use drugs, what the Bible calls sorcery, and they'll use deviant lifestyles. All these things will suit their purposes. And we've looked at psyops in the past. We're going to look at them again in the future because that's one of the main tools that's being used to deceive Western society. When something major happens in society, we must be able to think critically and spot propaganda. We have to analyze the source. Is the source credible? Who owns the platform that we're getting this source, or who paid for the scientific study? Question the timing. Are they trying to cover up something, or are they trying to distract from something? Track the narrative. Look for identical language in other major outlets. Do they all say the same thing? You can find videos online of hundreds of outlets using identically scripted dialogue. Look for emotional triggers that will motivate people to react. If they can provoke anger or fear, people will get involved in a way that's not healthy. It's the same with preachers who use emotion rather than rationality. What's the evidence for what's being said? Ambiguous statements and anonymous sources are a red flag. And just because somebody has a name on an interview, who are they really? What are their coverage packages? These things will dominate the news cycle. are there follow-ups to these things? Real stories are going to have updates, but these operations will disappear once what they've done is what they're intended to do is finished. You have to trust your instincts. At least you can trust your instincts if you prepared yourself for discernment. If the narrative of the story seems off or scripted, trust your instinct and back it up with research. And this is not just the news, is if you go to visit a church, use your instinct. Be aware of what's going on. Anthony Fauci has spoken about how Jesuit values shaped his life and career, and you saw what he did to the world. God gave you a brain to use. And Ephesians 6:12 warns about a government that is tied to dark powers. Always question authority. Even God gives it to you in writing with verification to question the authority, and he gives you the answer. You have to diversify your sources. You have to learn to spot fake news. If somebody says something in one place in the Bible, does it say the same thing somewhere else? Same way in the news. The Catholic Church itself fears what they call the Anunnaki. Most people think they're the same thing as the Nephilim. It's just through a different culture's eyes and language. However, the Jesuits seem to work with them, and we've seen that. Malachi Martin showed Satan was enthroned at the Vatican, and it was under the power of Jesuits that this happened. Ecumenism is a dialogue between two religions such as Catholics and Protestants. Many try to turn that into a unity, and the unity may not be possible, but a dialogue is possible. Anybody who's accepted Jesus as their Lord and Savior is a member of the family. However, the Jesuits are not seeking ecumenism of either variety. They're seeking syncretism, which is a fusion of different religions. We've seen this with literal idols being on the same altar as the statues of Jesus. That is never acceptable, and it's not acceptable to most Catholics, at least the ones who are discerning the truth. But far too many people are happy to worship Jesus along with the other pagan gods, and they're told that it's okay. The world is being told today that Islam is just the same, or Hinduism is the same thing. They're not the same. They're not even in the same ballpark. The Nephilim have returned, and things are going to get worse. And next week, we're going to start or return to looking at the final antichrist. And I promise next week will be shorter, by the way. I do promise that. But we're going to continue looking at the final antichrist and the AI beast and the transhumanism that goes along with it all. Proverbs 25:2 tells us it's the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. We have to pay attention. We have to use our brains. And many of these things have been hidden until the end, but the end is now. We each have the option to search out and find honor, or we can sit idly by. Not everybody's going to hear well done at the judgment seat. Choice is yours.